In terms of the comparison between the kind of philosophical approach and the scientific approach, I was very intrigued to see, on the one hand, that Peter was using explicitly philosophers' approaches to understand science and to look at how that might influence scientific studies of children cognition. On the other hand, I found it interesting how the kind of reflection on experimentation was also part of Diana's work, where she explicitly looked at, okay, how do we model that? What are the limits of or constraints by which we kind of set up experiments? And maybe we shouldn't treat animals as machines to understand their cognition. Maybe it's a limit we impose on them and on the way we understand their cognition, but rather we should kind of see them as agents, which is very, very important to understand cognition. What kind of processes do we find? What can we understand through kind of changing the philosophical perspective on the experiment? There was also something which was part of Kristin's kind of talk, where she showed kind of different ways of imposing on the one hand certain ideas of normativity and to look at basically how it was developed. And I was wondering, to what extent the scientists on the panel see their work influenced by philosophical ideas and also the limits of that. And then on the other hand, Kristin, how did actually the observation of scientists influence your work and your idea about scientific study of cognition? Whoever wants to answer first.
Well, I mean, just like, as I said, my advisor was Susan Carey, and her husband is Ned Block, who's the head of the philosophy department at NYU. And so there's always a lot of philosophy going on. And then Jerry Fodor's in the psychology department, but he's totally a philosopher too. So, it was like when I was, I think you get influenced by your grad school a huge amount. You just had to. It's like the way we did it then. And I think it's been hugely important to have had that influence on me. And I sometimes sort of bristle when neuroscientists say we've solved the mind-body problem. Oh, good. And there's a certain I think, and if you look at things like connectionism, basically they're trying to sort of go back to old-fashioned association learning, and we knew that didn't work, and everyone's sort of forgotten everything that was wrong with that. So I think it's always good to keep a foot in the history and the philosophy.
Well, it's always been remarkable to me that in the early part of the 20th century, when physics was making such remarkable advances in changing our worldview, I mean, Einstein, quantum physics, and all the rest of that, that many physicists were quite philosophical. There was a strong philosophical bent to physics then. People like Schrödinger and Bohr wrote books that you could consider philosophy books. And I think that was actually quite important to the growth of physics and the way people thought about physics and the worldview that physics brought to society at that time. And I'm always surprised that we don't do that more now. That seems to be sort of absent. That crossover kind of quality seems to be absent, especially now with biological sciences in general and neuroscience and psychology and the social sciences in particular, whose work must be changing our view of the world. And to do that without the aid of sort of a philosophical structure, to put it seems to me to be silly, although that's the way it's often pursued.
Yeah, cognitive neuroscience was supposed to include philosophy as one of the elements of it. And cognitive science, I think, took philosophy more seriously, but I think cognitive neuroscience probably just dropped it afterwards.
Well, it seems like cognitive neuroscience is more aligned with the eliminativist approach in philosophy of mind. And so once you've eliminated propositional attitudes and mental states like belief and desire, it's hard to know exactly where you're going to go from there. But I think that philosophy traditionally started off, also philosophers started off being scientists largely. There wasn't this division in the Greek tradition and even through the Enlightenment. And then something terrible happened, and philosophy went all by itself, away from the sciences. As the sciences developed methods and consistent sort of rules for engaging in their practice, they became their own disciplines. But what I've seen in my career is a lot of philosophers really going back to the sciences and getting trained in science as well as in philosophy. So when I did my training, Before I started graduate school, I spent a year at the Koala Basin Marine Mammal Laboratory with Lou Herman, learning how they do this research with dolphins. I was a philosophy major in undergrad, and then I did science. And then I went and got my PhD, and a lot of the philosophers found me quite odd because I had this training in the science. But that training was influential and made me realize how important it is to see how the science is done, to know what kind of questions to ask. Otherwise, you're an outsider. You're just, like a science journalist or something like that. Like you worry about being a science journalist. You worry about being ignorant about the science you're talking about. So when I did my PhD, I also spent a year doing a theory of mind study on children at Minnesota, and I've continued working with orangutans as well. I think it's essential for a philosopher to really do the science too.
But you wouldn't say that that's true the other way, in the other direction, right? I mean, I don't.
Yes,
I know very few scientists who feel that they ought to take a philosophy course.
They should, though. See, that's.
Well,
that's
I don't disagree with
yeah.
you. I mean, it's sort of a new two cultures argument in reverse somehow or another, that suddenly science has these powerful tools that just don't need to be informed by philosophy or history, which I think is a huge mistake. But you see it quite often.
Which is why cognitive science as a discipline can be so valuable. And when you're training people both in methods in, say, psychology and linguistics, and giving them philosophical training, putting this together, we've got a program at York where we do this, and those are the best students. The philosophers say they're the best students, and the psychologists say that they're the best students. I don't know about the linguists.
I mean, in practice, what I really liked seeing in this panel was actually that there are applications of comparing these two approaches, in the sense that the difference between how you model things, and to be very explicit about the way you design experiments and what the theoretical implications are. This is, I think, where there's a nice overlap between science and philosophy and social sciences. To look, for instance, in our change of understanding of how we model animal cognition, from the animal as a machine, which is kind of part of our historical heritage of behaviorism, towards the animal as an agent, which kind of co-designs the experiment. And we learn much more about cognition if we look at animals as agents, or look at least in terms of even kind of problematic biological terms such as goal-oriented behavior or purposeful behavior. I know that there are kind of some people flinch because it implies a form of teleology, etc., etc. Nonetheless, it is a notion that occurs in biology more often than not sometimes, especially if we don't understand the process. So to be explicit, at least to be explicit about the experimental design, can kind of foster such a change in what are we studying? Do we study the animal as a machine, as an agent? And I wonder what you would think, actually, in the comparison between animal studies and children's studies, what the change from the animal as a machine to an agent how it might help and how it might not help to compare between child and animal studies, the kind of cognitive strategies. Where are the similarities, where are the dissimilarities, what kind of dangers lurk in that comparison?
Unless you want, I'll jump in right away. I think that one of the things that we have a real benefit with when we do human infant cognition work is that we have, even though we were, as you said, an infant at one point, but we don't really remember anything about it. So that's not the special insight we have. The special insight we have is that most of the researchers spend a lot of time with infants. I don't know if that's right, but in my experience, when I see graduate students being trained in developmental psychology, they're spending a lot of time just hanging out with the kids and habituating the kids to them before they do a study with them, before they take them out of a room. So they get to build these relationships with their participants. And this kind of lay understanding that we have, that we develop just through interacting with the children and knowing how to coordinate with them and knowing how to soothe them and all of this, can be very different from the experimental research that I see being done with great apes, where you don't have researchers necessarily having a relationship with their subject. This was not true at Koala Basin Marine Mammal Laboratory, where there was really intense relationships with the dolphins and Lou Herman and Adam Pack and the other trainers and researchers. But a lot of times with the great ape research, you have people in scrubs, you have their faces covered, there's very little opportunity for nonverbal communication, and they don't have long-term relationships. They're separated with a plexiglass barrier as well, so you can't even have a physical interaction. So you have very different kind of starting position when you're studying another species that you aren't really familiar with, and you're studying a child who you've hung out with and played with and tickled and laughed with.
But wouldn't such a direct interaction not foster more idiosyncrasies in results? Like you've got on the one hand the interaction with the researcher as a kind of direct relation that might change results otherwise. You've got also the kind of individual character of the animal or the child. So how do you actually cope with, on the one hand, making your studies comparable, and on the other hand, possibly taking these idiosyncrasies seriously, especially if we talk about cognition and specific learning processes, the specific developmental stages? How can we understand basically cognition if there's on the one hand this idiosyncrasy of cognitive learning, and on the other hand we want to compare these processes? I mean, how would the scientists kind of see it in their own studies to deal with these kind of aspects?
I mean, there are sort of practical things, like there's lots of scientists who have missing fingers from getting too friendly with their chimpanzees. You know, I actually don't. I think actually we don't actually spend a lot of time with the infants when they come in. You know, we sort of come in and put them in the booth. And I haven't done infants for a while, but we actually don't do that. It's not that, but that doesn't mean that we're not interested in infancy as a phenomenon. I mean, we really study behavior, and we're part of that sort of community. So, I personally think studying development is hugely important as a process and as a field in itself. And sort of really understanding, you know, what children are like in all their aspects. And I think, just sort of going back to your original question, I think that part of being the scientist is having that kind of skepticism and always being questioned. Like, so when I talked about those give and hug studies, I've got like 10 other studies that are just trying to answer questions of critics, and you're like doing every single control you can to try and say, no, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that, you know. And you have to be really, really precise and careful. And you have to be sort of creative and come up with the right sort of controls to sort of counter it. And it's good. You know, you should always have these sort of people who are trying to say, you know, what you're doing is crap. Because I don't believe this. I don't believe babies are really doing this. Right? And you really have to sort of prove it. I think there's a lot of integrity you get from just having, just being forced to answer your critics, and that sort of part of the scientific process, I think, is really, really valuable. And it should always be a fight. It should always be a struggle.
I've sort of characterized this at one time or another as what I would call the double-bind of the double-blind study. You know, so ever since Clever Hans and that whole story, which I won't get into, but this notion that we have to have a double-blind, that you can't. That experimenters affect the experiment, especially when you're dealing with behavior and when you're dealing with animals in particular. And so everything has to be done behind the mask, behind some sort of cover, so that you don't cue the animals. But we all know that nobody learns anything cognitive without social cues. That this is part of cognitive development. And so you're asking to do a sort of an experiment in this barest bones kind of way without any social cues. And then you want to know why you're not getting cognitive behavior in animals, because you're not really giving them the opportunity to do that. I learned recently, and I think it's kind of interesting, that the attitude in Japan, for example, among researchers is quite different. So primates are a favorite area of study in Japan, and Japanese primate researchers are among the leaders in the world. But they have never had this, so in at least the American, to some extent the European, I think, work in animal behavior, there's this dirty word called anthropomorphizing. That is, when a researcher sort of gives the animals they're working with a sort of human idea. That is, that they have, giving them a theory of mind, if you will, that when you see an animal go for food, you say, oh, well, it's probably hungry. Well, that's anthropomorphizing. You know, you have to actually, I mean, that's an extreme case. But you can imagine a variety of cognitive behaviors where you could say, well, that looks just like a human behavior, and so it probably has the same motivations mentally as a human behavior. And that's become a dirty word in the behavioral world, behavioral psychology, and I think in the American school at least, but not among the Japanese, who believe that the critical thing to understanding primates is to understand their mental state, their mental lives, and observe very carefully and objectively. So they have this tricky way of observing objectively, but yet lending mental states to the animals they study, because they think it's the only possible way you could really understand the chimpanzee's behavior.
And Tetsuro Matsuzawa, who's the head of the Kyoto Primate Research Institute, has a commitment to the researchers having a bonded relationship with the chimpanzee they're studying. So chimpanzee I and Tetsuro Matsuzawa have a bonded relationship, and they're going to be together until one of them dies. The other chimpanzees that are being studied at this lab have bonded to another researcher who have committed to stay with that chimpanzee until one of them dies. And none of them have lost any fingers. Tetsuro Matsuzawa points us out, like, we have all our fingers and we go into the cages with them and we touch them and we play with them. And we don't just play with them, but they had a breeding program, so they inseminated all the females at the same time.
Not the cross.
They did it
That's
with
beginning to get
chimpanzee
really
sperm,
weird.
using and the mothers allowed their human bond relationship research partner access to the infant, and they hung out together. This is very different than the North American or European way of studying the chimpanzees, but it's based on there being a relationship. And the same at the dolphin lab. I saw relationships were very important to elicit the kind of behavior you want. So if you wanted a kea kamai to cooperate because someone was going to be filming her, you called up the woman who she really liked to come in and train her that day, because you knew that they work really well together.
Oh, okay. I'm very, very sorry. Then I would say we actually go straight to the audience. And if you have questions, now is the... Oh, okay.
I wonder how far you would, or what would push this idea of studying the normative behavior, because I mean, an extreme interpretation that what you're saying is that it's all just normative. I mean, whether you open the flap of the box by rotating it or sliding it, it doesn't matter. It just happens to be rotating or sliding. But you wouldn't say that it's something like infanticide. So that so the chimpanzees feel so vocal about preventing infanticide. I mean, you wouldn't say that they just happen to be in a norm where you didn't kill infants, but you could just as well have been in a norm where you kill infants and everything is fine. So there's something to the development of morality and not killing infants, which is not just normal.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's got something to do with some sort of a moral judgment, maybe something to do with harm or having some sort of empathy or fellow feeling going on. This is why I mean that normativity, as I see it, is a very bare cognitive lens. There's nothing that really rides on it. But it's different from just a representation of the world as it is, because if you see the world this way, or me jumping on the table, I'm just like, oh, that's the way it is. But if you see me jumping on the table right here in this seminar, you look surprised, you look shocked, you're appalled, because that's not the way it ought to be. And that's all. And I'm not hurting anybody when I jump on the table either. But it's an expectation the world ought to be a certain way that it isn't. And I think the clearest way to see evidence of that is to look for protests.
You know, what I thought was never mentioned in any of that is humor, which is another way of seeing as a kind of an ought. I mean, humor, usually something is funny because somebody does something that they ought not to have done in a way. I mean, they go
like
against
talk about
the ought.
penises.
For example. Right, I mean, it's amazing I got away with the penis thing today, right? I'm very cocky that way, though, so.
Good one.
Just to push it a little beyond the possibilities. This is purely a demonstration.
Don't push the demonstration further, please.
But you're right, it's a violation of a norm, of an
Yes,
expectation, and so we can be shocked, or we can find it
Or
amusing,
find it
or some
amusing, yeah.
combination of the two. And this is why I would love to know more about the hug and give studies, because the give when there's nothing there, that's a violation of a norm. That's weird. And so I wanted to ask you if you saw the looking times going up as the infants saw this behavior. So, because I'm interested in explaining, when kids start explaining, and you look and you see something weird, it makes you look closer, it makes you look longer.
Yeah, they only get 2 trials.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Actually, on the eye tracking, I think it's a different procedure with the eye tracking, so it's hard to say that. But in the standard procedure, you just do old, new, the other way around. So it's just four test trials, and so you don't really get a chance to see that. Although I did do some other studies where we weren't getting strong effects on some verbs, and then what I did see was on the first and second there was a difference. Yeah, so
Longer? So
one of them was longer. I can't remember which one, but there was a significant difference in the first new trial and the second new trial. So I sort of had an interpretation of that.
very cool.
So I think something Stuart said before about not only physics and the fact that there's philosophy, but they also eventually settled on models, right? So like
Settled on.
Models.
The standard, right? So in part of physics. What do you think the elements of a predictable model or a model that can generate some type of testable prediction for cognition require? What elements would that be? Because one thing I didn't hear, the one word I was surprised I didn't hear from anybody was the term prediction. It seems like everybody's in some sense talking about the ability to predict something about what my mental state, what I expect to happen next, and what that value. And maybe some difference between amoeba and us and the dolphin has to do with what levels of abstraction, time, etc. we can make those predictions. Just want to get your thoughts on how we might build some kind of model.
I mean, I think you're right. Yeah, I mean, I think prediction is a huge thing. I mean, it's sort of essentially, why we need to categorize anything, right? It's because we need to know, we need some sort of constancy over time, right? So we need to know what happened before when I saw these, when I encountered these things, and assume that something similar is going to happen in the future. And you can't sort of live your life like everything is completely unpredictable. I mean, it's sort of fundamental. I agree to everything. I think we just didn't mention it.
Do you think part of what's important about cognition is the ability to predict ahead and then to decide what, based on that prediction, if in fact that's a prediction that should now be incorporated in the model? So that this model, one thing that's different that you mentioned connections, right? So I think one of the issues in the world of machine learning, right, is in some sense that how one updates these models based on predictions is all very much based on some feature, there's labels of data, but that cognition somehow has this flexible ability not just to predict, but to update the model in some way that promotes the survival, the development, the social interaction of the work.
One thing about prediction is perhaps one thing is I'm urged to kind of slowly close, but there is a good thing, there will be cocktails, and I can predict that it will be easier actually to ask a lot of questions with a glass of wine and to basically thank the speakers for being here, for presenting their work. I apologize for going over time, but there will be wine, and you can basically ambush the speakers and ask all the questions now. Thank you very much.